Hey guys, Mr. Edwards here, Centreville High School Automotive Technology. We're back here today with our 1996 Toyota Camry. Got a significant item we're going to take care of on it today. We're going to be replacing our CV axles. Our front wheel drive axles, the axles that come out of the transmission, go to each wheel. The boots on them are torn. We noticed that on our used car checkout that we did. I'm going to show you guys that again real quick, and then we'll talk about everything we need to go through to be able to get those axles out and replace them with nice new ones. So this car, being that it's a front-wheel drive vehicle, the engine and the transmission are mounted right next to each other under the hood. The engine's going to be on one side, obviously, and then the transmission down next to it on the driver's side. So down here at the wheel, you should be able to see our axle shafts mount up to the transmission. This is on the driver's side, and then come out to the wheel. And on each end of them, there's a rubber boot, and inside that boot is what's called a CV joint, or constant velocity joint. That joint can move in any direction to allow the axle to be able to pivot as you're going down the road and go at all the angles it needs to go to transmit the motion of the transmission out here to the wheel. Inside those boots, to help those joints move, there's grease. And if these rubber boots tear, which rubber wears out over time, if these rubber boots tear, that grease can go everywhere. As you guys can see here, it's just all over the place. That's not good, because if there's no grease inside the boot there's no lubrication for the joint can wear out, and if you really keep driving it like that, the axle can fall apart. You don't want that to happen going down the road. We're going to go ahead and take care of that today. There's a couple things we could do. We either could just replace the boot on here, or we can replace the entire axle shaft. It is more economical these days usually to just replace the entire axle shaft, because axles have gotten so cheap, and that way we don't have to disassemble everything with our CV joint to be able to replace the boot. One thing you'll notice on the driver's side here is that the axle's relatively short. It mounts right up to the transmission, which is on the driver's side, obviously. Versus over on the passenger side, which we'll take a look at in a second, the axle's considerably longer because it has to come all the way from the wheel, across underneath the engine, all the way over to the transmission. So see over here on the passenger side, we have the same problem. Our boot is split wide open. There's grease all over the place. This one's actually been split open longer, I think, because most of the grease has dried up. It's not even oily looking anymore. But we have our axle shaft, and this axle shaft goes through that metal plate that's behind it back there with the bolt on it, where the engine mount is, and then continues all the way under the engine, all the way over to the driver's side of the car. However, this car has a little bit of a unique design, actually a very unique design. 99% of cars, what you have to do is take out a bolt or a clip up inside of there. You can actually see there's a C-clip on there, the two little prongs, and pull out the entire axle shaft all the way over to the passenger side. On this car, they have these bolts that go around the axle that you guys can see that I'm shining my light on right now, and they go all the way around, little hex bolts that you can undo, and then all we have to replace is this piece out here. The intermediate shaft that goes over to the transmission stays in the car. That's a pretty cool design, and if you saw over on the driver's side, it has the same design too, so we don't even have to pop the ends of the axle out of the transmission. All we have to do is unbolt them from the parts that lead over to the transmission. 99% of cars, we have to actually pop the entire axle shaft out of the transmission, so this is a very, very unique design, but you guys are going to see how to replace these on this car. So we're over here on the passenger side of the car, and we're going to go ahead and get this axle assembly out and swap it out with a new one. First thing we need to do out here at the wheel, obviously get the wheel off the car. We don't need to take the brakes apart to do this, as you guys will see, but we just kind of work around them. First thing we need to do is get this axle nut off of here, because this is what holds the axle into the hub. To get that off, there's a little metal cotter pin that goes through it that we need to bend down and pull out, and then we need to get this big nut off of here, the axle nut that holds everything together. It's really helpful to have an impact gun to get that off, because they are on there tight. So I usually just use a pair of side cutters, bend the cotter pin down, flatten it out some. That way we can pull it through and just push it back. If this pin's really rusty, it might be real hard to get it out, but this one is nice and clean. It's obviously been replaced at least once before. Wiggle on it some, and it'll pop out. Set that off to the side. Now we need to figure out what size our axle nut is here. Yep, that one will work. 32 millimeters. It helps to have an impact gun to do this, like I said, because these are very tight. If you don't, you can use a really long breaker bar, and you will be able to get it off. It's just going to have to use a lot of muscle. Get on there. With an impact gun, pops right off. Now, to get the axle shaft out, hopefully, yeah, that's just nice. See how I just pushed right back in. If it didn't push back in nice and smoothly, it was rusted inside the hub here, which a lot of times they are. That's when you bring out the big boy here and give it a little encouragement. My best tip to you when you're doing that, take your axle nut that you just got off, spin it back on here a few threads. That way you don't risk damaging the end of the axle shaft. If you're replacing the axles completely like we're doing, it's not that big of a deal, but if you're just taking the axle out to either replace the boot or do something else, you obviously don't want to mess up the threads on the end of it here. Set our axle nut off to the side. Our axle shaft end is nice and loose now. Now the next thing I want to do is get these bolts up inside of here that are holding our axle shaft to the intermediate shaft loose. I'm not going to take them all the way out because I'm not quite ready to pull my axle out yet, but I at least want to get the bolts broken loose all the way around the axle. They are Allen key bolts, and I'll zoom in if I can so that you guys can see that, which means that we need to find a Allen key socket that's going to fit up in there and fit inside the bolts, similar to this one right here. That way it can fit inside the bolt. You got to be really careful with this style of bolt, guys, because if you round them off, they are nearly impossible to get out if you round them off inside. So we need to find one that fits in there good. To get up in there, I'm going to use a big long extension like this right here, 3/8. Try this Allen key socket right here. Hopefully you guys can see as I get up inside of here. And that one fits in there good. Grab my ratchet. Oh. Alright, so as I'm trying to break these loose, take a look at what it's doing. You'll be able to see me spin the ratchet and watch what the wheel does, or the hub. It's spinning the whole axle. So I need to find something that I can stick in here to hold the hub still while I break those bolts loose. This ought to do. Now this is when it would be really helpful to have a second person to stick this in the wheel studs and hold it still, but if you don't and you're working by yourself like I am, you got to kind of make do. So I'm going to set this in here and then watch what happens when I try to spin the ratchet. It catches the wheel hub. Notice I put it so that it would hit that lug nut there because I don't want to damage the threads if I can help it. Now I should be able to come in here and hopefully break these bolts loose. I come at a different angle here. New approach. 1/2" drive extension on there now with a reducer. We'll try an impact gun. There's one. Like I said, I don't want to take them all the way out. Just get them loose. There's two. There's three. There's four. There's 5. And there's 6. Okay, so all 6 of the bolts that hold this axle in are loose now. They're not taken all the way out, they're just loose so that we can get them out by hand once we're ready to actually pull the axle out. It was a little bit of a pain to get those loose because they are really tight and the wheel's trying to spin against you. I ended up using an impact gun and an impact extension. You guys got to use what you got basically. If you aren't able to use power tools like what I'm using, you're just going to have to kind of fight it. So the next thing that we need to be able to do is get this axle back out of the hub so that we can pull it off the car. We need to get the whole hub and everything here out of the way. The easiest way to do that on Toyotas is separate it down here at the ball joint, because there's 2 nuts and a bolt, 17 millimeters. Pop those off and the whole bottom part here is going to swing out and enable us to get that axle out of there. On many other cars that aren't quite as easy to get the ball joint separated down here, you can just take the 2 nuts and bolts off up here at the strut mount and be able to swing it out from the top here, swing it down. Either way works. If you choose to unbolt it at the strut here, you should do an alignment afterwards though, because that can mess with your camber angle, one of your alignment angles. Alright, so if we were working in the shop to get these 2 nuts and the bolt off down here on the bottom at the ball joint, I would probably just use an impact gun, but because it's so close to the ground here, I'm going to use a big long 1/2-inch ratchet and a 17 millimeter socket. They will be tight, I can promise you that. Make sure you're loosening. Oh, there's one. Spin them all the way off. 2. And 3. So now with both the nuts and the bolt out, we can take a pry bar and stick it in here under the ball joint and hopefully pop it loose. So when you pop it loose, the whole assembly will swing out like this. The lower control arm is separate from the ball joint now, and you can pull straight back on the axle shaft. Pull your whole assembly. Be careful not to put any tension on your brake line, your ABS wire here, but be able to swing our axle out just like this. So now that we got our axle popped out of the hub, we need to come up in here with our Allen socket and extension again and finish getting these Allen bolts all the way around the axle all the way out, and we should be able to pull our axle out of the car. Because I broke them loose while the axle was still in the hub, they should be pretty easy to spin out of here now. There's one all the way out. There's 2. 3. Spin the axle around some. There's 4. 5. One more. Down to our last bolt to get this thing out of here that doesn't want to come out, but it's going to come out. There we go. Our axle is unbolted, and it should just slide straight out the bottom here, like so. Be careful not to lose any of the bolts or anything, just in case we need them with our new axle, which we're going to take a look at here in just a second. I think we had a ball bearing fall out here. All that stuff should come in the new axle though. And there you go. The axle's out. Grab the gasket off of here. So we've got our new and our old. And as you guys can see, the old one kind of fell apart as it came out. All the ball bearings in the end of it came out. This new one's held together with a zip tie here to prevent the same thing from happening. We're going to leave those zip ties on there until we're ready to put it up in the car. Now you guys can really see though why we're doing this. Take a look at that outer boot on the old one there. See how it's split wide open? Nice new one, not split open. Alright, so our new axle's ready to get slid up inside the car. You guys can see we greased it up good on the bearing end of it on the inside. It came with a packet of grease. It comes with new bolts for itself, which is good, and a gasket that has to go on this end here to seal everything up good. So now that I've got this greased up with the gasket on the new axle, I got a couple of the bolts just pushed through it. I'm gonna slide it up in here without making too much of a mess, hopefully with grease. And just get a couple of the bolts started by hand. And with a slight bit of struggle, get the axle lined up and just get all those bolts started by hand. I went to World War III with this thing to get the axle lined up. It did not want to go in straight, and if you get the axle in at an angle, you will cross thread those bolts. The axle has to go straight in to get those bolts in. Again, this is a very weird setup for axles. Usually they are just pop in, pop out, but this design, well, it needs a little creativity, put it that way. We're going to come up in here and go ahead and tighten all these bolts up. Remember, they were tight. There's one. We'll go a star pattern like we're tightening lug nuts. That way they get tightened down evenly. Get down here to this one. I know you guys probably can't see over on this side too well. Come over to this one. 6 bolts. There's number 3. Come back up top. 4. Turn the axle some. Ooh. 5. 6. And we'll just double check them all to make sure they're good and tight. Don't need our axle falling out going down the road. All good and tight. All right, let's get the axle back in the hub and then we will get everything bolted back up. So to get our axle back in the hub, it's reverse of what we did before. I'm going to use one hand to pull out on it while I get the axle and just put it through the back of the hub like so. And then come over here and wiggle on it some. And it should push through just like this. It has splines on it. I'll take a look at the old one over here to show you. It has those splines, the lines in it. Those splines have to line up with the inside of the hub. You can't force it through. Those have to line up. If they don't line up, it won't come through like this. Now to get the ball joint back through the control arm here, I'm using a pry bar to pry down on the control arm while I push in on the entire knuckle and everything here and get it to drop back through just like that. Now, if you guys can see, if the brake hose isn't in the way, hopefully, my ball joint is back through my control arm. I can put those 2 nuts back on the bottom down here and the 1 bolt. Now that we've got our ball joint back in the control arm here, we can go ahead and put our 2 17mm nuts and the bolt in the back into it and make sure that those get tightened down nice and tight. So with our ball joint tight now, we can come back here and put our big axle nut back on. It should go on nice and smooth by hand. Spin it down on there. Shouldn't feel it binding up at all. We don't want to cross thread it. Our new axle did come with a new nut, still a 32 millimeter. And we're going to take our impact gun, put it on tighten, get it good and tight, and we need one of the little slots in it here to line up with the hole that's in the axle so that we can get our cotter pin through it. Just like that. The cotter pin, one end of it is a little bit longer than the other one. We're going to slide it through the hole in the axle. Should go through nice and smooth. We're going to take the longer end of the cotter pin and bend it over. Again, using a pair of side cutters, just like what we used to get it out. Helps sometimes to tap the cotter pin up through, just like that. We'll take the longer end of the cotter pin, bend it over, tap it down, and then the other end of the cotter pin, just trim it off like that. This cotter pin will prevent the axle nut from being able to back off if it were to get loose somehow. So that's it for this side. We got a nice new axle in here now. Boot's not torn anymore. All good to go. If you guys get any grease on stuff when you're pulling the axle out, putting the new one in, make sure you clean it off good like I did here, especially on the brakes. I'm about to spray this with some brake clean. Make sure that gets cleaned off really good because you don't want to have grease on your brakes. And then over here on the driver's side, we obviously did the exact same thing. Nice new axle, no more torn boot. All good to go. Alright guys, so that's it. We got the front CV shaft axles replaced on this 1996 Toyota Camry. Both of them are all good to go now. No more leaking boots. Obviously, as you guys can see, this is a little bit of a process, but it's certainly something that you can do. You can even do it at home in your garage. You might get a little dirty. That's what my gloves looked like before. That's what they look like now. But that's just a sign of hard work. Make sure you guys fill out your reflection sheet that goes along with this video. I hope you guys learned something and enjoyed watching, and I'll talk to you guys soon.